Can everybody hear me okay? Nobody can hear me. Does anybody know how to turn these on?
It's this mic.
We get another cord, so we ask your patience for about 2 or 3 minutes.
This evening, before we get started with our keynote lecturer, Dr. Han Suyin, I'd like to briefly explain the week events that the Institute on World Affairs has scheduled. Films will be shown in the Pioneer Room at noon daily to complement the afternoon and evening lectures. For a complete listing of these lectures, films, and art exhibits, I suggest that you get one of the brochures that we're passing out at the door. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, GSB for funding, the U.S.-China People's Friendship Association, and the Overseas Friendship Association. I'd also like to thank the faculty, and especially Dr. James Lowry, for assisting us with their guidance and help in planning this institute. Now, if I may turn our attention to tonight's speaker. From 1956 to 1975, Dr. Han Suyin spent a part of each year in China. She witnessed the Chinese Revolution firsthand and has investigated practically every aspect of political and social life in China. Dr. Han studied at Yenching University, Brussels University, and received her medical degree in England. She has lectured and traveled in 25 countries, practiced medicine in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaya, and written numerous books, the most recent being My House Has Two Doors. I'd like for you to join me in welcoming Dr. Han Suyin.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. It's a little bit low, so can we? Well, I'll just have to put up with it or take off my shoes. Ladies and gentlemen, my dear friends, I'm very happy to be back in Iowa. I was here a few years ago on a lecture tour, and coming again to your state, I have a sense of kinship and friendship, something which I value very much indeed. I think that we are gathered today not to speak or to hear a lecture of great profundity, not to speak as experts, but to examine in this changing world of ours some of the concepts and assumptions which are made about the consciousness of that nation, China. People talk a lot about the material achievements of China or the non-material achievements of China. What I would like to do today is to talk about sense of identity and perception of reality. I think that every country, every nation, and America in a most clear manner do question themselves, do interrogate themselves What am I here for? What am I doing? What is my role in the world? Your country, America, through its 200 years of existence, has gone through this appraisal and reappraisal of what its role is. And in the ups and downs of your history, in the hours of victory and in the hours of defeat, you have accumulated experience, acknowledged facts or not acknowledged them, which have added to the wisdom of your living and to the history of your nation. And the wisdom of living and history of a nation cannot be divided. Now, we in China, we have also accumulated a very long history. And in this history, we have had also our perceptions and assumptions, our assumptions of what the role of this culture, nation, state China was. And what we would like to speak about today in simple terms is this consciousness. If an individual can have a feeling of what he is, a search for his identity and for his expression, so much the more a nation. And this search has to be done again and again. The role of any community does change in function of a changing world, of increasing or decreasing wealth, prosperity, population, geographical boundaries, and so on and so forth. And so now, let us, in very simple terms, do this about China. I had at first prepared a rather highly abstruse and what would be called an expert paper on the subject. But I do not think that expert papers really answer problems as well as a way of questioning them in a more human form. We can never at any time and in any technology, however advanced, take away from it the human factor, precisely because the human factor is unpredictable and cannot be computerized. And we see it in today's world. For a very long time, the Western world has thought of progress as something linear and continuous and eternal. All we had to do was just keep on progressing. But is that true? And do we not see today, on the contrary, the beginning of a new age of unreason through, for instance, religious fervor in all its aspects and in many areas of the world? I am not only speaking of the events around our dear person, the Ayatollah, but for instance also in India, we see very perceptibly the signs of a Hindu religious revival, which is anti-progress, which harks back to the past, and which cannot be explained in logical scientific terms. And so therefore, in our examination of China, let us not abstract this human element at any time. Now, what also I am going to talk to you about is not the result of much reading, but much more the result of my own observations with a certain amount of reading. I am indebted to all the historians I have read, among them many American historians, for my understanding of Chinese history, and also to many Chinese historians of today and of yesterday, some of whom I have the pleasure to know, and others whom I have had the pleasure to get acquainted with through their works. I think that it is no use my saying what everybody knows, that China has a very, very long history, 2,500 years, or much more, even 3,500. But until the 10th century, around the year 1000, with the Song dynasty. I think we can say that for 1400 years, from the 4th century BC until around the year 1000, the Chinese conception of itself was subject to change because it is a land that has been much invaded. The invasions and conquests of China by foreign dynasties who became its rulers cannot be ignored. They have had a lot to do with the forging of national consciousness in China, with its strategy and its polity, its way of looking at problems. I will not go into ancient history because we have so much to talk about in modern history, but I would like to talk about, for instance, the Tang dynasty. Now, the Tang dynasty, everybody knows, was the glory of China. But it must be remembered that the Tang emperors were Uyghurs. They were Turkomans. They were, therefore, they had an appor, a cross-fertilization syndrome in them, which probably was the reason why the Tang dynasty was so extremely international-minded. This is not to say that Chinese culture was not a dominant factor, but that added to it, there had been the recognition of the importance of relations and a spirit of inquiry into the customs, the ways of living of other countries. This is, I think, what really distinguished China, not only in the Tang dynasty, but even before it in the Sui dynasty, a kind of spirit of inquiry, geographic and others, which produced, therefore, this great dynasty. And it was coupled also with great prosperity and with the rise of caravans and trade all over the world. I think that the significance of trade and commerce in forging national consciousness should be studied by you young people. We have a tendency to look down on business as if there was not a great romance in it. To me, it has always been a banker is one of the most romantic people in the world. Well, to begin with, he takes so much risk, especially now that finances are a very precarious thing. But there is also a spirit of adventure in the things that are done in banking and commerce and all these enterprises. And I think at that time there must have been, in the Tang dynasty, a great feeling of adventure in many of the areas of consciousness of that period. By that time, of course, China had already developed what in Europe had not developed yet, the sense of a unity of culture and a unity as a nation. This, of course, was done way before, 10 centuries before the Tang dynasty. It had already begun. Not only a geographic unity, but also, and most important, I think, a cultural one. And the idea that transport and communication was a network which kept this unity together was also developed. This is a very modern idea in China. And finally, and most important of all, I think that the Chinese culture was particular in this respect, that it looked upon time and history as history-making factors in themselves. In other words, what anybody who has any acquaintance with Chinese culture notices immediately is that the Chinese, in his psychology, does not live only in present time. He talks of the past as if it was yesterday. All my friends say, oh yes, you remember in the 3rd century AD, a general of such and such a state used such and such a tactic in order to put down his enemy. Now, this is exactly what is happening today, and so on and so forth. There is always and all the time this cross-reference in China which leaps over the centuries. And this is because history to us is a very living thing. And it is immediately accessible to anybody trained in China. I have not found this particularity in any other country. I think it is extremely important to remember this about China, that we do not make an arbitrary division between the past, the present, and the future. Maybe because we do not even have declensions of past, present, or future in our verbs, but chiefly because, to us, history is a continuum, and history itself is a reference to create precedents for more history. For instance, another example, the recent self-defensive expedition in Vietnam, which was not understood in the West. But every Chinese with any kind of culture understood it immediately, of course, because it has been done before many times in Chinese history. When wayward bandit neighbors gave us trouble, we used to send out a little expedition to give them a little hiding and then go back. And to us, well, it was quite certain that this was only one more of these, shall we say, small demonstrations that you can't hit us all the time without really getting hit back occasionally. And this was, again, a reference to history. I could go on forever showing you how, therefore, from the Tang Dynasty onwards, this notion of history as the creator of history has inhabited China. But until the year 1000 AD, because of these great waves of conquest which swept over China time and again, there was also a certain flexibility, except in one area. That area was, on the one hand, a factor for intelligent continuity, but on the other, an enormous factor for conservatism. And I am talking of the Chinese literocracy, the Chinese scholar, who is also the establishment, who is also the bureaucrat, who is also the great preserver of what is called China and its philosophies, and the repository, therefore, of its wisdom and of its historical sense. Now, this class, for we can call it a class on its own, is also unexampled because there is no corresponding intelligentsia in the West which corresponds to the Chinese intelligentsia, nor to its role, nor to its sense of responsibility towards its own nation and people. A sense of history and responsibility which goes back 1,700 years. This establishment really only came to what I would call total solidity in the year 1000 or so, with the Song dynasty, when it became the repository of the Confucian and Neo-Confucian philosophies. And there was, after that, and right until now, the 20th century, for 1,000 years, and despite further invasions by the Mongols, for instance, and by the Manchus, there was very little social change of any kind. In other words, China did not develop capitalism, nor the Renaissance, nor the Industrial Revolution that you did. Although the opportunity was there, it could have been done. How did actually capitalist enterprise, the Renaissance, develop, the Industrial Revolution develop in the West? If you really dig right down, it really started with maritime enterprise and expeditions, which provided the foundation for what afterwards became the capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. And in China, there was a sector of society, traders and voyagers, travelers, who could have therefore been the spearhead of this evolution, but it did not happen. And it did not happen, curiously enough, because it was checked by that establishment, by that bureaucracy itself. Now, right up to the 1405 and 1433, there were enormous maritime expeditions sent to Africa with this extraordinary man, Admiral Zheng He, who was a eunuch and who employed Islamic crews. I have traced in the mosques of Suyin the relics of these crews that were employed by Admiral Zheng He. But by an edict, even shipbuilding was stopped. And therefore conservatism came in. And this conservatism reflected itself in the fact that the social classifications in China did not move, did not change, right up until the 19th century. And they were therefore a very small class of traders, always controlled by the bureaucracy. The landed gentry which produced the bureaucracy, establishment, literocracy, the scholars, and that enormous mass, the peasantry, which supplied everything that was necessary in order to keep China going. It was successful. It was a very successful arrangement for many centuries. And right up till the 19th century, after all, China was renowned throughout the world for its prosperity. It was admired by Voltaire and by the first Europeans who went to China for the harmony and the wealth and the civilization of its cities. For many things, therefore, it had been a success. Now, this success bred, quite logically, the assumptions and the consciousness of those times of what China's role was in the world. And China saw herself as a most civilized nation, surrounded by people not so civilized, and therefore unwilling to have too much to do with them, self-sufficient, wanting nothing from others, not at all expansionist or invasive, but wanting peace on her borders, very reluctant to move, moving occasionally on what I have described, those punitive expeditions, but without really staying there, always returning, and above all, wanting to be left in peace and to continue that way. That was the assumption, the kind of perception of the world which the Chinese had. And it was not an illogical one, it was quite a reasonable one. That was the way the world looked. And that was the way the world was to the Chinese. But it did not, of course, stay that way, as you know. And it did not stay that way because of the rise of the West. The rise of the West, the Industrial Revolution, which also challenged, therefore, this autarky of China and this concept which the Emperor Qianlong even put in a letter to the British envoys who came to ask for trade. We have everything in our land, leave us alone. We don't really need anything else. This was challenged, as I say, and therefore, that is why historians of China today date the Chinese Revolution, which we are undergoing now, which is by no means finished. We are right in the middle of it still, to 1840, the First Opium War. 1840 and the first guns to shoot their way into China changed these assumptions, this perception of China in the world which he had. It forced these ideas to the ground. Now, why is it, we may ask, that such a profound change occurred then, when it had not occurred before? For there had been many ups and downs in Chinese history. Many dynasties had been overthrown, and always in the same way, by peasant revolt, through hunger and famine and injustice. The peasants rose and overthrew the dynasty, and very often it was a poor peasant or a poor monk, because we do not have an aristocracy in China, who seized the reins of power and established a new dynasty, or else it was a foreign invasion. But always and always, the old order was reestablished through that extraordinary thing I have spoken to you about, the Chinese bureaucratic literocracy, the establishment, which went through everything and cynicized everybody who came in. But this time it was different. And it was different because this very class, this extraordinary body of people, the mandarinate, the bureaucracy, the literocracy, were thoroughly humiliated in what they held most dear, which was their philosophy and their conception of the world. This was smashed. It was quite different from taking, say, a barbarian Mongol. He came in with his troops, okay, but his son was more Chinese than any Chinese. He was finished. Or a Manchu, it was the same with them. They became the best calligraphers in China. They forgot their own language. Culture finished them off. So the establishment won every time. But this time, it was different. This time, the very foundations of the moral order of China were destroyed, or appeared to be destroyed. And this is the most interesting factor and phenomenon. When I have Western friends who moan to me that the Chinese Communist Revolution destroyed the culture of China, I say, oh no, oh goodness, no. Quite the opposite. The only threat there ever was to Chinese culture came from the West. But Chinese culture did survive it, and for a very simple reason, because there were just too many Chinese. Already by 1885, there were 400 million in China, and there is a safety in numbers. These cultures in which many, many people practice the same culture cannot be destroyed, and are much tougher than cultures in places where there are fewer people. Africa has had many cultures destroyed by the West, but not China, not India. But there was change, there was humiliation. And the humiliations, the degradation went on. So that suddenly at one moment, an extraordinary phenomenon occurred, and this was that the Chinese Mandarinate, the literocracy, was forced to re-examine every proposition it had held dear and to find out whether it worked or not, whether it was true or not, to question itself again, and to question its concepts, all of them. I think that is fascinating. History hasn't been written that way. History has always been written as wars and destruction and this and that. But what happens within the soul of a class that is responsible as repository of the thought of a nation? This is very interesting. Now, several events occurred at the same time in order to create modern China through what appeared to be the destruction of the old order, and one of them was the Meiji reform in Japan. For Japan also encountered the same problem, but to a much lesser degree. To a much lesser degree because it did not have, as in China, this rigidity also based on a profound solidity of the system which China had. Japan was much more labile and therefore much more alert to the fact that it had to change or to die. And so they changed, and they changed more quickly. And in return, the Chinese scholar class became influenced by what was happening both in Japan and chiefly in Japan and to itself. And so therefore, we entered the 20th century with a new breed of scholar class, profoundly influenced by Japan. If you read the stories of those times, and I recommend it because they are fascinating, you will realize how much Japan provided a kind of a bridge for the new scholars of China in order to be able to understand and to evolve a new conception of their own role and of the role of their country. Very interesting and fascinating. Lu Xun, Sun Yat-sen, so many others were influenced by Japan, by the Japanese efforts to adapt to the modern world and to change. And China began to change also. Out of, therefore, the destruction came China's revolution, a revolution long drawn, a revolution which at the moment is by no means ended, and which began, as I said, in 1840, which saw its first major turning point in May 4, 1919. May 4, 1919 remains, I think, in the heart of every Chinese as a kind of a glowing beacon. The idea of the four modernizations of today is not a new idea at all. It goes back to May 1919. May 4, 1919. At that time, for any student of Chinese history and of that May 4, 1919 movement, it would be clear that within the new scholars of China, the young intelligentsia, which had grown up between the decay of the old order and the first few years and terrible, difficult years of this new order, it was quite clear that there were several currents of opinion and thinking. It is not true that the May 4, 1990 movement was either entirely communist controlled or communist influenced, or as some other, entirely influenced by Dr. Hu Shi because he had studied in America. It's not true. It's a mixture of everything. It was a kind of a whirlpool, and at that moment, anything could have happened. But what did happen was conditioned by one factor, and this factor was the following: that at that moment, the West let China down. The Versailles Treaty, signed at the end of the First World War in May 1919, determined the direction in which China should go, which would be a Marxist revolution. Because at that moment, the whole of that scholar class felt entirely betrayed by the democracies of the West. And they felt betrayed because they were betrayed. After all, China had been an ally on the side of the Western democracies in the First World War. But at the end, none of the promises which were made to her by the democracies were kept. And this determined the fact that China's new intelligentsia, therefore, turned elsewhere. As they said at that time, we now know that no sun rises for us in the West. We turn elsewhere. And in 1921, the Chinese Communist Party was formed. So, in those extraordinary years, we see how history was determined not only by internal factors, but also by external factors. And from that time on, China was forever aware of the external factors, as well as of the internal ones. If anyone will read Chinese history or look at the events in China with this eye of an inner perception, this will be very clear. It will be very clear that at no point from that time on was there really a return to that self-enclosed wish which had kept China, after all, quite immune from what they regarded as outside barbarism for so long. This did not happen again. Then, as you know, came the revolution. But, as I have told you, it had been prepared since 1840. And it went on. It went on to its logical consequences, for the consequences were logical. There could be no other way. Because once again, what happened was that there was, as the driving force, as the fuel, as the infantry, the propelling action in this revolution, there was the peasantry of China. A factor so much neglected by Western historians for so long. A factor so well known by the Chinese intelligentsia and the Chinese landowning class. Why, even today, only the other day, in Peking, a minister said to me, people talk a lot about what goes on in the cities of China and at Democracy Wall in Peking. But what is important is not that. What is important is the peasantry. Only by the peasantry do we stand or fall today. Today, this is just as true as it was 10 centuries ago. China stands or falls by its peasantry. And the Chinese Communist Revolution was made by China's peasantry. Since we had no industrial revolution, and therefore a very, very small working class, These simple facts have conditioned the shaping of the Chinese Revolution until today. It is only now, when we talk about the four modernizations, that we are really going to begin our revolution. We have only done another phase of it, and it has been a most necessary and essential phase. But only now and only today do we really begin the industrial revolution of China. So, from that point of view, the element of the peasantry came into this modern revolution. And what is very interesting to me, my friends, is the way to look at it. You know, the way I look at it is not the way you'll find in books. And maybe I'm wrong, but maybe I'm right. The way I look at it is this, is that in China's communist revolution made by the Chinese Communist Party, there was from the beginning a conflict, a dichotomy, a kind of a unreason between the people who made it, who were the peasantry, and the theory, which was a theory of the 19th century industrially revolutionized West. The second contradiction which I found, and which also reflected itself in the history of the Chinese Communist Party, was the contradiction between its model, the Soviet Union, and the realities of China. So therefore, here comes a very big problem. There is a theory, but how do you adapt it to this country, China, where the concrete realities are not according to theory? You talk of a working class leadership. Hell, where is the working class? We got 400 million peasants, and we got scarcely 1.5 million workers in the cities, and they can't move because the cities are under a military dictatorship. What do you do? It is the genius of Mao Zedong to have bridged this gap and to have found a wonderful formula which bridged the gap by saying that this was a revolution made essentially with the peasantry, but under the leadership of the working class. Well, that was a stroke of genius to say it that way. The leaders may be very far, but I suppose the theory was there. And the second stroke of genius of Mao was to realize that during the first few years, from 1921 right up to the Long March in 1935, the most essential difficulty that the Chinese Communist Party encountered was its model, the Soviet Union. In other words, the theory was wonderful, but the practice was horrible because it wasn't adapted to the realities of China. And since Russia even then thought that they were the model for the whole world and that they knew everything better, I think it was Mao's genius to start saying, no, we do our revolution our own way. And to start, therefore, evolving in his writings an attempt to put together these essential elements of China and to make Marxist theory fit them. In other words, he was doing once again what the great genius of China has always done, Sinicization. And that's right. That's right. Every revolution, by undergoing a culture change, when it goes into a certain country. No revolution is ever going to be like another one. When the revolution comes to India, it's going to be an Indian revolution. It's going to be done the Indian way. And therefore, there's never going to be the same phenomenon repeated exactly anywhere twice. And this is where I think we all owe a great debt to Mao. It's because he had the courage to not only see it, but to translate this as much as possible into realistic terms, methods, and policies. 1935 to 1945, in these 10 years, were the years in which Mao wrote down as much as he could of the way he felt that the theories of communism should be apprehended and utilized. And this is what is called Mao Zedong thought in China, applied to China, not to anybody else. Can't work anywhere else. You're not Chinese. Can only work in this culture context, which is China. But very useful for China. And that was why the revolution was won. It was won because of that adaptation, because of that understanding. It forged the Chinese Communist Party as a leadership organization which could cope with many problems which otherwise could not have been coped with. And then came 1949 and a new phase. And now came modernization. And now was set the goal for new China. Now that the victory was won, the political victory was won, now had to come the most difficult part of all, which was to build a strong, industrialized, independent, prosperous, socialist China. Now, how do you do that? It sounds very easy on books, but how do you really do it? And where is your model? Do you have a model? Is there any program? There is no program. There is no blueprint. You have to evolve everything. You have to invent everything. And therefore, you have to make experiments. You have to try and try and try again. And it is at that time that you suddenly realize that you are always a prisoner of your past. A thing which Marx had already said. He said man makes their future, but they don't make it the way they want, because there's always the past coming back and coming back. And this is what we have realized through these 30 years of New China, 49 to 79, that we had not only to cope with the difficulties of the present day, but also with the past. And this past was all the more clinging to us because we were such historians and such historiographers, because to us the past was still such a living thing. And so our feudal past is still with us today. And until we get rid of it, we will not advance very quickly. We have got rid of some of it, but not everything. Now, in these 30 years, what conception of China's role in the world, what conception of, what perception of the world, what perception of China itself has been evolved? Well, I distinguish three phases. In the first phase, I would like to quote what Mao said in 1956-57. And when he said that by the year 2001 there would be many great changes in China, and that he hoped that China's contribution to the world would be much greater than it had been. That he hoped that China would play her role as a responsible and equal factor in a great concert of nations in independence and equality. And I think that this formulation really explains so much of China's many attempts during these years, attempts which I have seen myself, to open the doors to the outside. Unfortunately, my friends, at that time, as you know very well, your country's perception of China was slightly different from what it is now. In fact, it was totally different. It was absolutely contrary to what it is now. You perceive China as the greatest danger of all. You perceive the Chinese Revolution as the Ayatollah Khomeini perceives President Carter today, as Satan. It was worse than Satan. It was hell. We lost our China, said some of your very deeply in love with China Americans, but unfortunately in a highly emotional state. And so, to cut a long story short, it was extremely difficult to put this thing across. Although, as I say, Premier Zhou Enlai tried and tried and tried again in Bandung, and in 1956, and again in 1959, and again in 1964. Very difficult. You perceive China as the enemy. The West shut its doors. Time and time again. It was a very hard time. And once again, the Chinese perception of its role was influenced by this. It was influenced also by the fact that we realized that our model in theory, the Soviet Union, was also changing. It was changing in its aims and ambitions. And it was looking upon China as a necessary satellite for its dreams of world empire and hegemony. And the crux of it came in 1958, when Mr. Khrushchev precipitated himself in great agitation to Peking to tell Chairman Mao that the Americans were planning a nuclear attack on China. This was a lot of hooey. And that, therefore, in order to protect China, China must allow the USSR to put nuclear installations in China. And so, therefore, there would be wonderful partnership between China and the USSR against that great imperialist power, the United States. And Mao Zedong only asked one question, and whose finger is going to be on the push button? And Mr. Khrushchev said, well, mine, of course. And so Mr. Mao said to him, well, the door is there, and you just open it and get out. Well, I'm kind of making this funny. Of course, it wasn't said in that funny way. But that was the crux of the matter. That was the crux of the matter. And at that time, if you read attentively the newspapers, you see very well that there is in China a very thorough explanation of how China conceives itself as a totally independent nation, self-reliant, needing perhaps help, certainly, but willing to learn from everybody. It was at that time, in 1958, that Mao evolved the phrase, let foreign things serve China. once again. But it is very difficult to do it when foreign people shut the doors and do not want to help China. And so therefore, there came in a period of what I would call transition, in which, during the leap forward, there was an attempt to substitute for the machines which would never be there, manpower, and manpower alone. To do everything in the old feudal way, with that human capital of which we had only too much man. It succeeded partly, but not altogether, because we are in an age where the speed up of technology is such that it is almost impossible to catch up by feudal means. By just manpower, it is impossible. But it was attempted. For good or for ill, I regard the Great Leap Forward as a most fascinating human experiment. I was there during that time. And then, what happened after that? Well, after that came the 60s, and as you know, the war in Vietnam. And for us in China, there came a bad turn, and that was the feeling that we were going to be squeezed between two imperialisms, the United States and the USSR. That they were getting together, and that possibly we would be the pawn and the victim of an entente between the two superpowers. And that was because at that time, after the Cuba episode, it did look as if the two mightiest nations of the world might really get together to make a new division of the world between them, as they had begun at Yalta between Roosevelt and Stalin in 1945. So this also conditioned the Cultural Revolution. It led to an ultra-left, a kind of a radical, almost fanatic way of looking at things in China. And now that you have seen what happened in Iran, you will realize that there are these tremendous waves of emotion which sweep upon a people when they are in a quandary, when they feel threatened. In a way, the Cultural Revolution was made under the auspices of many things, of many concepts, one of them being not to go the way of the USSR, which now China looked upon as a growing imperialism. It was also a way to energize the people into a consciousness that they must rely on themselves. But, and this was the unhappy side of it, the theoretical argument which did it most harm and which was advanced was this one: that the world had entered now a new period of revolution, and that this new period was the era of Mao Zedong thought. In other words, for the first time in its history, and for the first time in its revolution, it appeared as if China was making herself the leader of world revolution. A thing extremely strange, which did not last very long, but it lasted about 2-3 years. If you read the documents of that period, you will realize this strand coming through. It led to excesses outside China. Friendship associations were told, in Cambodia, for instance, to take down the portrait of Prince Sihanouk and only leave the picture of Mao. The same thing happened in Burma. And of course, it made the heads of state very angry. After all, Mao was not the president of Burma, nor was he the head of state of Cambodia. So this was excessive radicalism, ultra-left radicalism, and it had a totally erroneous perception of the world and of the dangers on China. However, as I say, this period passed over. And already by 1969, there was readjustment of this. But there was also a total readjustment and reappraisal. Once again, a totally new perception began of what the world was really like, and therefore what China's role in it was going to be. Very interesting for students of foreign history. You see, until round about the middle of 1960, the Soviet Union had been talking of the socialist camp, an assembly of socialist nations, and on the other side there was the capitalist camp with the capitalist nations. Not so, said China. No, it is not so. The world is not divided like that between the good and the bad, the socialist countries on one hand and the wicked capitalists on the other. This is no longer true. And this new conception of the world, this new perception of how the mainstream, the main forces in the world were divided, was evolved against what I have just been telling you, this ultra-radical sort of way of looking at the world, as if there was going to be a revolution in America and everywhere else, just like that, in the twinkling of an eye. And this is what is called the three-world theory. There is no longer any socialist camp, said Mao Zedong. It doesn't exist anymore. There is no such thing. And not all capitalists are bad. On the contrary, some of them are jolly useful. And some of them, indeed, for their own sake, will be getting nearer to the third world and will even be helping it. And so there was a new reappraisal of the world outside China, and therefore of China's role in it, which started in the 1970s to be formulated. It was formulated by Mao in 1971, and it was formulated by Deng Xiaoping at the United Nations in April 1974. You can look up the reference. So you see, my friends, through these years, China's conception of its role, China's conception of the world around it and how it functions and so on, has had changes and reappraisals. And I must say that I feel that the last and third formulation to which they have come is pretty accurate in many ways. It is pretty practical. It works. And now we are in this new phase of China's revolution, a new phase in which, therefore, there must be new perceptions, new approaches, new concepts, guided by what I have just told you, the three-world theory. It's all of a piece. The three-world theory, China's modernization, and China's role in the world, and the way she envisages it. Well, to begin with, there was President Nixon's visit to China, the Shanghai Communique, followed over the years by the normalization of relations this year, removing, therefore, this many years of misunderstanding and artificial misunderstandings which had been created, and creating a new situation in the world, responding to the changes in the world, but also creating a new situation. There has been, on the part of your country, a great deal more thoughtfulness and maturity than at any other time in your recent history. this is very clear. It's very clear to me, it's very clear to the Chinese. You have become thinking of yourselves as responsible in a concert of nations. And this is very important. In other words, you two no longer divide the world into the goodies and the baddies, the reds and the whites. You act in a way which is far more realistic than it was. And so does China. And I think, therefore, that within the next 5 or 10 years, the chances of this closely sticking to realities and trying to understand the situations as they are, if this continues, and if the responses to situations are adequate but in no way unrealistic, I think the chances of peace and of having, therefore, a better world are fairly good. I am not at all pessimistic. That is why it is so important, I think, to go away with this notion. China and the Chinese people are interrogating themselves about their role of the world. They ask themselves all the time. I know because Premier Zhou Enlai held a conference specially on that. Side. What do we know of ourselves? Why do we think as we do? We have all the time to interrogate ourselves, to make this self-analysis. And I think if every country and every person in every country did that, well, we would really get somewhere. And that is why I'm very optimistic, because I think that at least in China, a great many people are doing it. They are interrogating themselves. And only through this self-analysis, self-probing and self-questioning can we get rid of the feudalism which is still haunting us today. Attitudes to certain old problems. I hope that in the future, some of the things I have said today will prove, or well, not maybe 100% correct, but useful, helpful in trying to assess, to look at things. As Mao Zedong himself said one day, when you have a problem, the way you ask the question to a problem sometimes solves the problem. It's the way you look at it which determines whether it's a problem or not. And I think it's very important, therefore, that we all learn to look at things with new eyes. I remember the first time I went to China, I went back to Peking in 1956. I met a little policeman who was so nice, so clean, and so round-cheeked, he looked like a little doll. And I said to him, oh, you know, there used to be a well in front of my house, and now the well has gone. And he said, ah, comrade, you must never look at today with yesterday's eyes. So let us look at today with today's eyes and take good heart and good cheer. Things are not so bad. Things are not so good. But the world has muddled through for a long time, and I'm sure that we shall all muddle through together, so long as we continue to try to understand each other and also to try to see that two people never see things the same way, but they can still be good friends. Thank you very much.
if anybody would like to ask questions, you can stick around for a while. She's willing to answer them for you.